Hello, and welcome to the panel discussion following the screening of Push the Film. I'm James Benton, Director of the Race and Economic Empowerment Project at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University. The screening and panel discussion are part of the New Social Compact, an ongoing convening that seeks to build new approaches to prosperity for the post-pandemic working class. We ask that you mark your calendars for June 2nd and 3rd, 2022, when the Kalmanovitz Initiative hosts a public forum, the Pandemic Worker Wave and a New Social Compact, a public forum on working class prosperity in a transformed world. This event will continue the diverse and inclusive conversation about the future of democracy, economic justice, and the working class. 2 years ago this month, the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded with a virtual shutdown in communities worldwide. The crisis, as we've often said here, revealed even more clearly many of the social divides that existed before the pandemic. And as the movie has shown, issues of housing affordability are not unique to the United States, nor are they unique to the period we're living in through this pandemic. Housing affordability is one of the social divides that has been exposed even further by the pandemic. It's affected communities large and small as rising prices inhibit mobility and threaten to displace millions of people through mass evictions. Rents are increasing at astonishing levels. The real estate search and brokerage service company Redfin earlier this year estimated that rent has gone up 15.2% in January 2022 to $1,891 per month. That is difficult because mortgages are also increasing. Mortgages are actually cheaper. Redfin's estimate of median mortgages showed a 25% increase in January 2022 to $1,595 per month. That's up 25% over January 2021. In places like New York City, Texas, Florida, rents are soaring across the board. In Las Vegas, legal aid attorneys are currently defending a renter who is facing a 427% rent increase. So it is evident that the housing crisis, exacerbated by private equity, the Great Recession, and now this COVID-19 pandemic, is posing a real issue that housing activists and communities must address. And it's especially important as far as a new social compact is concerned, because if we have housing stability and affordability, that is a basic building block from which we can begin to, from which people, families and communities can begin to seek a greater degree of not just economic stability, but social stability. So today's panelists are going to help us make sense of what we've just seen and what we're experiencing now. They bring a wide range of knowledge and personal experience to help us understand better this crisis in housing worldwide, large cities, suburbs, college campuses, military bases, et cetera. So I'll introduce the three panelists and then we'll go ahead and get started. Desiree Fields is an assistant professor of geography and global metropolitan studies at UC Berkeley. Her research deals with the role of housing in capitalist urbanization and includes the uneven restructuring of urban space and social relations around housing, as well as the struggles for justice that arise in opposition to this uneven restructuring. She's published extensively on housing financialization, movements for justice, through essays, working papers, and reports. And you can learn more about her work at www.desireefields.org. Our second panelist, Leone Jose Biquieri, is founder and executive director of Chicago-based Working Family Solidarity, which seeks to build interracial solidarity and promote labor rights education among working families in Chicago and in Illinois. Working Family Solidarity believes that workers' rights and housing rights are essential for working families to secure economic stability rather, and that strong interracial alliances can help build power to make this stability real for working people. He has a decades-long track record of organizing and advocacy on behalf of workers for economic and racial justice. Our third panelist is Sofia Lopez. She is Deputy Campaign Director on Housing at the Action Center on Race and the Economy and conducts research into support housing and racial justice campaigns nationwide. She works to expose the ways in which finance and real estate use housing to extract wealth from communities of color and then use that wealth to increase their power at local and national levels. She, along with Professor Fields, testified in October before the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee on how private equity landlords are changing the housing market. Sofia has worked as a community organizer in city governments and as a community development intermediary. And so I want to welcome all three of you for joining us today, as well as our audience. And without any further ado, I'll get into the initial question. I wanted to ask that how each of you have seen the effect of private equity in housing in the works that you do. And as the panel members answer, audience members, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat box. We'd like to turn to the audience for questions during this discussion. But first question to members of the panel, how have you seen this financialization play out in the work that you do?
Okay. I was gonna say you might want to choose one of us.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Jose, go ahead.
Sorry, I can start, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I think what's really kind of interesting to, or kind of like useful to consider in relation to the film is the way that we talk about like basically like a pretty long-term set of problems at this point, right? So like we use the language of the housing crisis to talk about problems of evictions, overcrowding, the rising cost of housing, substandard conditions, homelessness, displacement. So like this constellation of problems has become pretty enduring and pretty normalized, but we continue to use the language of crisis to speak about it. And I think it's useful to think about like what crisis actually means, right? So the language of crisis usually evokes the interruption of normal functioning, right? And I think a lot about Stuart Hall's understanding of crisis. So Stuart Hall argues crises occur when, quote, the social formation can no longer be reproduced on the basis of the pre-existing system of social relations, end quote, right? So like, in other words, crises in the system of capitalism, crises are moments of systemic change, right? It's a moment when the profitable reproduction of the system is interrupted, can no longer go on as usual, right? And of course, the outcomes of that inability of the system to reproduce itself, the outcomes of that are often experienced in our lives as crisis. And of course, that falls in uneven ways on some places and some people more than others. But I think I start with this, like this definition of like what a crisis means in the sense of capitalism, because it's actually like quite different than what we talk about when we talk about the housing crisis, right? I think what we call the housing crisis is not really an interruption to the operation of the system, right? So what we call the housing crisis is a feature, not a bug. And I think the manifestations of like treating housing as a market commodity are what all of us are concerned with, right? So I think we can go back to 2008 and say like, yes, that was a crisis because the system of capital accumulation that is predicated on mortgaged home ownership and mortgage-backed financial instruments could no longer be reproduced in a profitable way, right? And I think that was a crisis in a capitalist sense. And my work focuses a lot on what happened in the aftermath of that crisis, right? So I look at the corporate consolidation of housing in the single family rental market. And as we saw that footage of Steve Schwartzman discussing Blackstone's, kind of entrance into the single family rental market, what we saw after 2008 was that investors began to buy up all of these foreclosed homes, distressed real estate, as a way of basically restoring the profitability of the system under new conditions, right? And so today we have, a handful of corporate landlords who control between them almost 300,000 homes, right? And so, when we talk about how does the current housing crisis show up, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that what is a crisis for the system versus what is a crisis on the ground for everyday people are often like pretty different things. And so for Blackstone, for Invitation Homes, for Freddie and Partners, for American Homes for Rent, the situation that we're contending with today is in fact not a crisis. It is the successful resolution of the 2008 crisis, right? And in fact, what we see today is that whereas many folks thought that the pandemic would actually spark a housing collapse, like the same one that enabled corporate landlords to get their start in the first place, instead we've seen an incredible housing boom, right? And so the pandemic has really demonstrated how actors like Blackstone, like Invitation Homes, like many of these other, large-scale investment firms hold an advantage, not only in the context of, kind of a systemic crisis like we saw in 2008, but also under like really, fundamentally strong market conditions. And so the way that I see financialization, kind of showing up in the work that I'm doing is that as we see the increased consolidation of corporate control over land and housing, we're also seeing the kind of inequities that are, that are at the heart, the kind of unequal power relations that are at the heart of housing markets under capitalism, I think being, magnified to a really, dramatic extent.
Okay. Sophia, Jose, what are your thoughts?
Leonie, it looks like you are ceding the floor to me. That was, I think, a perfect and beautiful response, Desiree. I'm kicking myself because I talked to a reporter about the housing crisis earlier today. I wish I had had your framing in mind because it does make so much sense to me. How it reminds me in so many ways of the pandemic. How long can we sustain this sense that we are in an acute crisis when in reality, through my view, elected officials have just ceded that this is the way that things are for so many people across the United States, and I think are just all too willing to put the wants and needs of their political donors ahead of the lived experiences of the most vulnerable people in our communities. So watching this film and trying to like synthesize what I see as the kind of consequences of the financialization of housing alongside with this film that we just watched together. I love watching the special rapporteur's attention to talking to mayors, talking to Blackstone directly. Of course, it didn't really work out the way that we would have hoped, but I think that it's kind of indicative of the design and the function of our housing economy in the US. So, watching that final scene where she's saying, oh, there's a shift in how mayors are thinking about housing. It's so optimistic, but if only, right, that these declarations had really triggered the kinds of changes that we would have hoped between 2019 and today. So my work, for people who don't know it, at the Action Center on Race and the Economy, is focused on supporting grassroots campaigns on a range of issues, all focused on the intersection of Wall Street and racial justice. As the Deputy Campaign Director for Housing Work, that means I focus on housing campaigns. So we do strategic research looking at the corporations that are really driving the circumstance that so many people are living in. And I have to say, the manifestations of the financialization of housing with the folks that I interact with do fit along the lines of what we saw in the film. So people who have no idea who their landlord is because there's this shadowy LLC that doesn't make sense. So when people are trying to actually hold their landlords accountable, they don't know who their landlord actually is. I think, I don't want to say since 2019, but it's been gratifying to me in my role to see a sort of savviness take shape across the housing justice movement. I love to think about how many people understand how to find who's behind an LLC or try to find who's behind an LLC, and then take a step beyond that to try and understand who the pensions are who are actually invested in some of the biggest corporate landlords, and actually taking an approach called capital strategies to try and hold investors accountable to say, similar to what we heard in the movie, you can seek a high return on investment, but at what cost if this is the impact that you're actually having on people who have to live in housing? And I think one of the things that I find myself saying again and again is we get this really nice narrative coming from industry, real estate industry folks, right? That they're professionalizing the market, that they're giving us this really great product. But if you spend any time listening to tenants at all, it's very clear that the opposite is true. So working with groups in New York, in California, in Chicago, really all across the country, I hear again and again and again, things didn't start to get bad until a private equity company came in and took over my home. That's when I got an eviction notice. That's when I got all these fines and fees that don't make any sense to me for things that I'm not even getting. This is when the fines and fees are such an issue. This is when my rent started to go up by hundreds, if not thousands of dollars from one month to the next. Really just this laundry list of abusive practices that, sure, I mean, I think we can agree that tenant landlord relationships have always been complicated. And there's like a fundamental imbalance of power when you're dependent on somebody else for a place to live that is not accountable really in any kind of way. And we can also talk about how the shift that Desiree described post foreclosure crisis has meant that we have a fundamentally different kind of industrial scale landlord that fully and transparently intends to buy a greater and greater share of our homes. So it's absolutely cause for concern for us to recognize that, okay, this is exactly the model and the kind of business playbook that these entities use. We know that they want to own more and more of our homes, but thankfully, maybe I'll stop here. Thankfully, the housing justice movement is only growing stronger, is only consolidating. It's unfortunate because I think that means so many people are going through the pain of having one of these predatory corporate landlords. But I think we are in a moment where the tide needs to shift in the opposite direction, and the people that I work with are, of course, nothing short of an inspiration to me on a regular basis. But I have to be optimistic that when we organize with one another, when we put our strategies side by side, that we're able to build up to something bigger and fundamentally undercut what it is that the industry has planned for all of us in our homes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And Leone, your thoughts as to how you've seen these changes or any trends or any shifts as a result of what's happened or what's been described in the film today.
Yeah, let me say thank you, James, and I'm glad to be here with everyone and with the other two great panelists. I wanted to just say briefly for our work at Working Family Solidarity, again in Chicago, I'm the executive director. Our mission is to unite low-income families from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, especially African American and Latinx, to fight together for equitable development. And we focus mainly on jobs and housing. So we're somewhat like a worker center that focuses on organizing workers at the workplace and beyond the workplace so they have a place to live. And so we try to link those issues. I'm going to try to avoid some of the really great points that both Desiree and Sophia touched on and try to talk about some others, but what you both said is already like terrific. So I'll add a couple things. What we're trying to do as we work with low-income workers of color, primarily on the west, southwest, and south sides of Chicago, is build class consciousness, but not through dogma, but through organizing and trying to figure out how we can work together, overcome racial divisiveness, which is really key. Desiree talked about capitalism, and it's one of the things that keeps the wealthy elite going is that they throw in that racial divisiveness when we start to have successful campaigns on better jobs or better housing. We're forced to compete for what we're told are scarce resources when we all know there's enough resources, but just a few people have them. We push for that racial unity, again, looking at our class situation, and we link the jobs and housing. So we do things like racial unity dialogues, know your rights workshops, teach-ins, justice campaigns. Our teach-ins and racial unity dialogues tend to be on jobs, housing, and then 3 things that we think you have to work on somewhat in jobs and housing, and that's immigration, civil rights, and criminal justice, because the oppressors kind of figured out how to keep us from either voting or getting housing or getting good jobs through that immigration/criminal justice system, which now is melded together in ICE. One of the things that we really push for our members and constituents is we need to organize around material reality. And what Desiree talked about, it really resonates with me as far as capitalism. We're in a certain stage right now where private equity is one of the phenomena that we see. So you can look at it like a problem. You can also look at it like a symptom, right? Because what we're dealing with is not the not only the commodification of housing,
Right.
we're dealing first with the commodification of human beings.
Mhm.
So if human beings by the owner class are not looked at as humans, but people who produce to give them wealth, then why would they look at us as anything else in our housing? Of course they won't. I like what Desiree was saying about capitalism, right? This is a crisis, but for whom? It's not a crisis for some people. Some folks are making a killing, right? So one of the things we try to help people think about as we see the gentrification occur. So James, one of the things happening to me and my family, my wife and 2 young kids,
Mhm.
we identify as Latino. My mom's from Mexico, my dad's from Italy, but I identify very strongly as Latino. And we live in Pilsen. I see a couple of folks from Chicago on the call. So we're one of the rapidly gentrifying areas. We hope we can stay here, but we don't know. And one of the things that happened to us, James, as far as how do we see this playing out, is going back a few years when I was the executive director of another worker center here in Chicago. We were organizing workers, and workers would come to meetings and say, man, this was a great campaign. We gained more wages. We got some workplace rights, better conditions, respect. But I just want to let you all know I won't be coming to the meetings anymore. I'm going to be moving a few neighborhoods away. I'm going to be moving out, past Cicero, right? I'm going to be moving down to Harvey. I'm going to be moving way out to Summit. I'm going to be moving out because my rent just doubled. And of course, as everyone on this call knows, I recognize some of you, the crime that these people have is getting up early in the morning and working really, really hard to keep the economy of Chicago going, mainly, again, Latinx and African-American people. So that's one of the things that we saw, James, and that led us actually to forming Working Family Solidarity to continue with labor organizing, but like some labor groups might focus on immigrant workers or African-American workers or a certain geography or a certain industry, we decided to form a worker organization that, in addition to workplace rights, focused on housing rights, because if we don't tie them together, as everyone's talking about, we're lost. I'll say another thing or two briefly, and then I'll leave it for now. But when we look at, again, I just really focus on what Desiree was saying. That was kind of my main point, which is let's be concerned about private equity, but let's not trip over it too much. Like, oh my gosh, private equity, what are we going to do? Because this has been done to us for 150, 200 years with more modern capitalism. Depends on how far you want to go back, right? But the whole alienation of workers, the whole thing, like many of our members do not know where they work. And I'm not lying. Like, you talk to them and say, where do you work? Well, I work at this place in a town called Carroll Stream, about an hour's van drive from Chicago. Okay, what do you do? Well, we produce Beanie Babies. What's the name of the company? No idea. But do you have any idea who owns it? No. And just like you were saying, Sophia, we also don't know who owns the apartment. So When we look at it, the United States structure and many other countries is based largely on the disempowerment of people of color and also really poor whites. And so when we see that and kind of reflect and understand that, then we can kind of understand that private equity is a current step in that evolution that's really important to kind of make no one really responsible for anything and shift all over the place. But it's part and parcel of the political economy, which is capitalism. You can like it, not like it, but that's what we have, coupled with the sociocultural paradigm of white supremacy. And if you keep capitalism and white supremacy in mind, that's the material reality we're organizing in. So it has to be anti-racist and anti-wealthy elite. And I think private equity is just kind of the latest form of that, of making those layers of irresponsibility between whoever makes money, those faceless people, and those of us producing the wealth.
Okay. All right. So I want to turn to the search for solutions. I think we've been hitting around it. Each of you have been hinting around it in the answers that you've given, or at least laying out the groundwork for recognizing where we are so that we can begin looking for solutions. I want to pose a question from one of our audience members. And that question is this. The position of some people in the film is that housing justice can be achieved through reigning in capitalism where housing is concerned, and legal challenges on the basis of human rights. Could panelists give their perspective on how viable these strategies are? So how possible is it to, rein in capitalism and then use human rights for legal challenges? I'll say, Sophia, if you want to take a shot at that.
Sure, I'm happy to start.
Okay.
Yeah, I think our panelists are all in agreement that reigning in capitalism is a fundamental necessity to actually improve our housing situation. But I appreciate Leonie taking us much further out because it is absolutely a systemic issue. The thing I didn't say when I described our organization is that in addition to housing, we focus on policing and mass incarceration, environmental justice, tech. I'm going to forget some of the other sectors, public services. So city functionings, our budgets, and every single one of these things has cutting across it Wall Street and white supremacy, to use Leonie's terms, absolutely taking advantage of our white supremacist culture to extract maximum profit for the benefit of Wall Street. So yes, without a doubt, I think I would disagree. I don't know if others had a reaction when they heard Leilani Farha say, I don't see capitalism as necessarily or inherently problematic. I do. Me, Sophia, I do. So I think, yes, beyond just reforming capitalism, I think that we need a fundamentally different economic structure. And getting rid of the ability to speculate and derive and extract profit from land, from shelter, is a fundamental necessity. Like I said, I think there are a couple of strategies that we can get into a little bit further on for how we can do that with respect to housing. I would say, unfortunately, I believe personally in the values that are described in the framework of human rights and international human rights, but I think unfortunately, in the same way that I described our political system being kind of captive to the interests of real estate investors, I think that our legal system is also hostile to the framework of human rights. I think that's true within the United States. I think that's true abroad. So I think there are unfortunately limitations to pursuing housing justice through a human rights framework. And personally, I think about these things in terms of power, which is why I talked about organizing in my previous response. I think that there are kind of on the ground, day-to-day, or kinds of organizing that need to be done to build up the strength of the housing justice movement to take on the power that the real estate industry has. And I think that is going to be the transformational mechanism. I think that courts can be really helpful, but ultimately I don't think they're going to save us. And I think that's true of elected officials too. I think that we need to fundamentally restructure who has power within our society so that we can make decisions for ourselves in a truly democratic process. And I think that's ultimately what it's going to take. So I
Okay.
will stop there.
Okay, well, thank you. Desiree, your thoughts on this question?
Sure. Yeah, so I definitely agree with a lot of things that Sophia had to say. I think, yeah, as a political economy, I think capitalism is not a system that that we can continue and also achieve this ideal of housing justice, right? Like I think they're fundamentally incompatible, and the idea that you can kind of separate out like certain kinds of social relations like housing from the capitalist system more broadly, as Leilani Farha seemed to propose in the film, I think I just don't think that's necessarily the most viable path forward. And I think like Sophia, it's not that I disagree that housing should be a human right. I just think that we, even in places that like South Africa has enshrined a right to housing in their constitution, and there are still homeless people there. There are still people, who are being evicted, right? Like there are still people there's still like massive residential segregation by race and class. And so I think, the ideal of like thinking, that if we have a legal human right to housing, that somehow that's going to be the thing that fixes the, the like massive inequities that we see in our housing systems. It just, it doesn't make sense to me on its face, I guess. And so, I think the question of reining in capitalism, there's, I think that, there's always a tension between kind of, like reforming the system versus like, tearing the system apart and making a new one, right? And I think, we can kind of think about some of these strategies operating, on different levels, right? So we could take something like pro-tenant reforms and like rent control across the board everywhere, right? Like we could say like that's reining in capitalism, but actually that would go pretty far toward like helping a lot of people, right? And so we could consider that potentially reformist move, but one that would be pretty radical in in the United States. And so that could be considered an example of reining in capitalism rather than transforming the system, but it would nonetheless like make a lot of change, right? I think a lot about Moms for Housing. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Moms for Housing, they are a group of homeless and marginally housed Black mothers who occupied an investor-owned home in Oakland, California. And, it was both kind of like all of the women were unhoused. And so it was both like a practical move of like housing themselves and their families, but it was also, a collective protest basically against the way that real estate speculation is transforming Oakland on the back of a highly racialized, housing crisis caused by, like predatory lending in 2008, right? And so so Moms for Housing, their occupation of this house in West Oakland was a protest against the way that speculation is displacing Black Oakland residents, adding to the crisis of homelessness and gentrification. And they did mobilize some of this language of a right to housing, but I think more importantly they claimed like a right of belonging, which was based not on relations of property ownership. They weren't agitating to be able to like get a mortgage and buy the house, right? They weren't saying like we should have a legal human right to housing. They were saying like we have a right to live here because we are from Oakland, we have relationships here, we are part of the community here, and these speculators, they're buying this house from from some like wealthy community in Redondo Beach, California, right? And like they were making claims to place on the basis of relations of care, not on this, which are fundamentally collective, right? And not based on property rights, not based on an individualistic human right. And so I think that kind of movement for me is like a really important example of not an effort to rein in capitalism, but really, through, while rent control could go some distance, right? I think Moms for Housing shows us a way of thinking about like fundamentally transforming the system, right? Like claiming a sense of ownership over a place that has nothing to do with property rights that end up like ultimately dispossessing a lot of Black and brown people, but claiming rights of ownership on the basis of relations of care. And so I think, there are all, I think there's a lot we could say about like the, like the viability or like the success of that strategy. But I think it offers a way of thinking about housing justice that is transformative and that is not necessarily thinking within the system that we are currently operating in.
You mentioned this as the way you describe it, it sounds like it's more local and granular, so that there's a focus on building power among people and among communities. And we hear examples of that through the film, people talking about squatting, people talking about having demonstrations or negotiations, people discussing how to approach pension funds and say, you need to change your practices because the work that the pension fund managers are doing is actually creating this issue or exacerbating this issue in local communities. And I guess my question would be, is this something that, are we in a place where building power, as you've mentioned, is maybe more crucial than thinking about larger conceptual terms of capitalism versus reform versus change? Or is it all part of this? Are they all part of a continuum where people are trying to build the power to make the changes that they can see and benefit from? I'm going to turn.
Can I take a stab? Can I take a stab at that?
I was going to go right to you, Leone. So go right
No,
ahead.
just because I find myself enjoying and liking what the other two panelists are saying. I also want to take a moment to say that I know a few people on this who are here attending, and others I've heard of, and others I can imagine. So I just want to say, I also recognize that there's 3 of us panelists and a moderator, but I also want to recognize some of the people on this call have a tremendous amount of experience and like could be up here, like any one of them taking an hour. So thanks for listening a bit to us and today. But one of the things I just really appreciate the question from, was it Anna? About how viable is it, and just to build a little bit on what Sophia and Desiree said and James kind of led into. So when we at staff anyway at Working Family Solidarity, when we go talk to folks, we don't talk about hey, we struck a blow against capitalism, and we don't talk about we're really alienated from the profits here, this is a shame. And we don't that's why I say we need to organize. We believe we need to organize. But for Anna, I think that's a great question. So I'm not so sure we ever talk about reining in capitalism, but I think one of the things that I opened with that I think is really critical, because you might like it or not, right? That's fine if you like it, but you must understand what you're organizing in. So if you don't understand, and I mean, I'm not saying you, but we talk to people that if we don't understand, and we don't even say capitalism, but our political economy and how it works and how private wealth works and ownership and the sociocultural paradigm of white supremacy, if you don't organize with those 2 in mind, you will do nothing. Not in housing, not in worker rights, not in women's rights, nothing, because you'll be organizing in a, you won't be counting on the material reality of our situation, right? So we have to think about that as we organize, is my main point. And then I think what Desiree started to kind of touch on, what James was leading into, from there, what we need to do is talk with people about how they're doing at this moment. And someone who is in Chicago, those of you who are in Chicago will have an idea what I'm talking about. You go to a little village, 26 and Trumbull at 4 a.m, where all these vans are packing in and people are fighting each other and screaming and yelling to get in the van to go out to either Joliet or go maybe not that far away to places they don't know. They don't know the name. They don't know who's paying them. They get paid at the end of the week at a check cashing place. Sometimes they have mean people there going, give me that, you get this. They have no pay stub. They don't really want to hear after a 12, 13-hour day when they can barely get home to say hi to their kids, and especially if they're a Latina woman who got up at 3 a.m. to make tortillas by hand, they don't want to hear Leone coming by at 9 at night talking about death to capitalism. They got no time for that. Right. What they want to hear is, I'm owed $150 for last week because I was paid in 2 checks, 40 hours and 20 hours, to avoid getting 60 hours and getting 20 hours of overtime, and I can't pay my rent and I'm going to have to leave. Now, when we talk about what we can together try to do about it, she's all ears. But if we talk about, well, we have to understand historical materialism, folks don't have time for that. So I appreciate the question, because there's an important time to talk about those paradigms. But ultimately, I think when you talk about viable, and I think what'll win this struggle, in my experience, seeing like both from my own mistakes and seeing other people's mistakes and other people's victories, it's going to be about getting more people involved. We need more people to feel like someone's coming for me tomorrow morning and my family tomorrow morning, right? The more people can start to feel that way, the better chance we have of winning. Because it'll be self-interest, not in a selfish way, but I deserve to have a job and a place to live. So I think that's where we bring it down, make it really, really simple, name these owners, right? Figure out who they would, do they sit on the board of the United Way? Let's go over there, right? Like demystify who these clowns are and who are killing us and oppressing us. And then people can start to get excited about it, like the moms, that you talked about, Desiree, great example. So I think what we have to do is discuss, but then when we're organized, we need to get busy on those very, very important details on the ground.
Okay. Sophia, your thoughts?
I'm not sure quite what to add. I mean, I think absolutely this idea of bringing more people into the fight. I was distracted by this really wonderful question in the chat about retaliatory evictions and like the risks that people take when they get involved in housing justice organizing. I think it's so important not to glamorize that everybody should do everything all the time, but absolutely people are vulnerable in their current housing situations. Let's be very clear, but they're also very vulnerable if they decide to step out on their own and take risks by themselves. And so I think what Leonie was closing with made a lot of sense in the context of that comment. This is why so many of the folks that I end up talking to are doing everything that they can to make sure that they have an entire building or an entire set of buildings who are on the same page and who are going to step out and take action together, versus one person kind of choosing to do things on their own. That said, having an entire building isn't a guarantee that you won't face some kind of retaliatory measures too. I think from a strategic standpoint, there are things you can do to try and minimize some of that, but maybe I'll use that as a way to kind of bank shot back to your question, James, which is that, yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that building power is not, both of the things that you mentioned have to coexist together, right? So building power to actually be able to have conversations about accountability for the landlords that people are having to put up with, all right, or are living in predatory situations because of landlords who are seeking profits in the same way that happens in their working lives too. Yeah. So definitely not an either or for me.
Okay, it's all interconnected. Okay. Desiree, would you like to take an opportunity on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just add maybe like one more point to sort of round out this part of the conversation, and that is like when we think about, the kind of processes of financialization or treating housing, as a financial asset and using it to make new financial instruments and so forth, right? So when we think about the processes that are, depicted in that film, I think, and particularly through the focus on Blackstone and the ways in which they're operating in Sweden, they're operating in the US, they're operating in Spain and the UK, right? You really get, I think, a clear sense of how much that process of financialization depends on abstraction, right? Depends on basically like, not treating, housing as like a concrete material reality in people's lives, right? But like abstracting, evaluating homes as lines in spreadsheets, aggregating them on the basis of like similar, perceived similarities, packaging them and bundling them into financial instruments and so forth, right? So like that entire process is based on like lifting homes out of their local contexts, treating them, in quantitative terms, right? Like kind of, getting as far away from like the way that housing actually shows up in people's lives.
Yeah.
And sometimes I perceive a tendency in conversations about housing justice and about movements. Sometimes I perceive a tendency that that movements should be able to operate on that same kind of level, right? And there's this idea that like, that somehow like all of these like scrappy, amazing groups that are doing like, incredibly important local work, that somehow if we all banded together, that we would be able to like, defeat Blackstone once and for all, right? And I think I agree with Leone that we like, that we always need to be, like widening the circle and like bringing more people into these struggles. But I think the tendency that I saw in, that I saw Leilani Farha kind of like pushing in the film is this idea of creating some kind of like global cabal of mayors who's going to like, push Blackstone out of their cities. And I just, I guess my point here is that I don't think the way that we win is by trying to like put ourselves in the shoes of, like a global investment firm, right? Or trying to operate on that level. I think as soon as housing struggles get detached from that material concrete reality of like what housing means in people's lives, like we lose sense of like what we're fighting for. And all of that is just a really long-winded way of saying local struggles matter, material conditions matter, and we should never lose sight of that in our struggles for housing justice, even as we realize it's also a global struggle.
I think a lot of what you just said in your answer reminds me of a passage in the film where it was mentioned that housing had become commodified. And it sounds like one way to fight back against global capital is to move away from that commodification and continue to work to realize housing as a key instrument of human dignity and security. And for some reason, when Desiree, when in your answer, it just made me think about that particular passage in the film. And just like in the previous question, instead of thinking about global concepts alone, you try to pair it with the reality that people are living with, such as the example that Leone gave of the worker who got paid in 2 checks, who now is short and needs to find a way to pay the rent. Theory is nice, but it doesn't solve that very real problem at the moment. So we are about 10 minutes away from closing time. So let me turn to this one question that we got from the audience about the short-term risk for tenants if they choose to organize, and whether any of you have seen any retaliatory action when tenants join these movements. And paired with that, I'd like to ask what you think the times call for. Are we at a moment where larger organizing on the local level is crucial to getting us through, not just through this pandemic, but imagining a new social compact in which housing is that key instrument of dignity and security?
I can say something. I'll try to be brief so the others can say something too. I'm literally thinking of one of our members, Julia Peña. She actually suffered sexual harassment and a sexual assault at work. A low-wage immigrant woman from Mexico. She stood up for rights. We supported her. We did an action. She's doing well with our support. I mean, it's kind of going to be a longer term fight, and we're talking with other women and so on. At her place of residence, a few blocks from this place where she used to work, she's also getting harassed because the owner never comes by to clean, the pipes froze, so on and so forth. And for speaking up, the owner sent a number of nasty looking folks to threaten her and tell her that the rent is going to go from 600 to 1200 and she better pay up. And so some other community activists and then our organization were supporting her there as well, fighting back. And one of the folks called Child and Protective Services, Family Services on her, saying she's a bad mom. So all these things are coming at her. So I just want to, lift up what the person said about the realities. And what I always tell folks who haven't done this work is there's a reason it's called the struggle. There's a reason it's not called the walk in the park, going to a circus, going to an amusement park. But we kind of just say it because it's romantic, right? This long live the struggle, viva la lucha. But then it's a struggle. And we talk to folks really honestly when we ask if they want to work together with us. And when they say, yeah, because it'll be illegal if they fire me, right? We'll say stuff like, yeah, and they're going to fire you right away. So think about that. Right? Don't tell adults things like they can't handle it. Tell them what's going to happen. Right? Now we'll fight it. If you want to fight it, we're going to fight it. If they try to evict you, we're going to fight it. Will we win? We don't know. We guarantee that we'll have some kind of plan, and we guarantee you'll never be alone, and everyone's going to support you till whatever happens. And that's often enough for some people to say, you know what? I'm treated so damn bad. I'll take a shot at it. So I think we really have to get to that level, but I really appreciate what the person said. Yeah, I've seen so many workers fired. The first time I organized a big strike when I was working in the farm worker movement in the Northwest, many workers got fired. I was so upset. I mean, I almost freaked out. I couldn't sleep for like 2 days until one of my mentors came by and said, hey, man, you don't need to baby these folks. These are human beings. These are adults that have been through way more than you'll ever go through, man, or maybe. And you know what? They made a decision and you supported them. And now we got to figure out what to do next. So be real with people and let them make their own decisions. And then if they face reprisals, we can deal with it.
Okay. All right. Sophia?
Sure. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. I seem to have some roboticness on my end. But I don't think I can improve on what Leonie said. I think that was beautiful and absolutely grounded in, I'm gonna turn my camera off for just a minute, but absolutely grounded in the fact that people are adults and can make decisions for themselves, but need proper and correct information. I will say I have been astounded by the bravery that people show when they choose to take on a multinational corporate landlord who is harming their children in some kind of way, or is harming their siblings, their parents, their elderly family members. I think people get fed up with the kinds of things that they're forced to put up with. And I will tell you, having done work around the eviction moratorium, and when people were first getting kind of turned out of their homes back in 2020, I also saw a lot of people who said, I wish that I had the time and the emotional capacity to join with you and the folks that are trying to fight back against the fact that landlords have the ability to evict people right now, but I'm also completely traumatized by what has just happened to me, and I can't. And I think it takes a large degree of respecting what people are able to do and what they're not able to do, and the kinds of circumstances that people are forced to put up with in our economy. But that said, our housing justice movement is growing. I can see it. And I'm just completely inspired and floored by the things that people choose to do in really difficult circumstances. And I think for better or worse, it's going to continue to grow because I think people will continue to be harmed and refuse to put up with the harm that is taking place in our housing market.
Yeah. Okay. And in that vein, Desiree, what do you see as far as people organizing, and are we at I wouldn't say could it be a defining moment because of the housing crisis and its ongoing effect, and now this pandemic of which we are entering the third year? Are we could we be at a critical inflection point where activism could maybe make a difference for people in cities and communities all over?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Sophia said, yeah, we can definitely see the housing justice movement is growing. And I mean, even, you know, I think about gosh, I mean, it's almost 10 years ago now, but I think in like 2013 or maybe 2014, I put out a report with the Right to the City Alliance on the rise of the corporate landlord. And we were, you know, kind of talking to different local groups in some of the places where corporate landlords are really active, like Atlanta. And it was really challenging. It was really challenging to have those conversations with groups on the ground, because they were like, yes, this feels like this whole financialization thing feels really important, but it also feels very removed from the more immediate, you know, like problems that people are facing, which are eviction and homelessness and gentrification and all these things that are much more immediately tangible. And so when I think about like how challenging those conversations about financialization and movements were, you know, in 2013, 2014, and think, you know, fast forward to today, and it's incredible. Like, you know, every week, you know, there's some huge article in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal about investors buying up homes. And, you know, I hear, you know, just kind of like, you know, student, you know, obviously like I'm in a university, I hear students talking all the time about like, you know, making housing justice claims, like in the context of the university, right? And, you know, there's all kinds of, you know, kind of grassroots efforts to do things like unmask the, you know, the owners behind LLCs, right? And to develop like new sources of data and platforms that, you know, kind of shine a light back on landlords and make them more transparent. And so, you know, I say all this to say, I think the conversation has particularly around kind of housing struggles that are focused on financialization. I feel like the conversation has come very far in recent years, and you know, there's a kind of a wider popular understanding of what's going on. And so I think that to me feels hopeful, even as, you know, people's kind of basic, you know, kind of human dignity and you know, access to shelter are also, you know, kind of under threat. And so it does feel like something has changed, and that the, you know, that the movements are growing, and the kind of popular awareness of what's happening, of what felt like a very you know, kind of like invisible process, you know, as Saskia Sassen was talking about, right? This kind of like invisible, incomprehensible process, you know, is now actually something that a lot of people are aware of and understand. And that does feel hopeful.
Yeah. Okay. I want to acknowledge a couple of comments from members of the audience who were suggesting possible solutions. One had suggested that cities, when they own or control properties, instead of selling to investors, lease those to groups that are developing affordable housing. Long Beach has an affordable housing fund from fees paid by commercial and housing developments. Portland also sells properties they own to working citizens. And another participant, just cause eviction, not to include statutory tenant right to organize, concerted action, a la the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act. For those of you who may not know about organized labor, the Wagner Act is the keystone of allowing workers to organize in this country. So, so we are at roughly a couple minutes from our time limit. So I want to ask if either of the panelists have any final thoughts to share, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up with the program for today. So Leone, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, a lot, but I'm only going to say a few for now. I mean, first of all, again, to the other panelists, but also to all the people here. Obviously, we have a lot of people who probably done amazing stuff, and it would be cool to hear a lot more about all the stuff you're doing. I think one of the things that we want to help talk about, obviously, our educational system at all levels. Talking in the neighborhood, at school, really bolsters this whole idea of private property, right? And again, not to suddenly say, hey, let's not have any. I think that's too big a leap for everyone, right? Like, whoa. But private property to the exclusion of thinking of anyone else's needs, right? So you are self-made, even though the biggest factor in determining whether you're a millionaire is whether you were born a millionaire or not, right? So there's very few sort of self-made people. So we want to also, look at our educational system, make sure we're helping our kids understand. You never get any kind of labor education in high school, right? You don't get that much in college. Social Security, God made it. No, people died to get that. Women's voting, right? Obviously, racial, the genocide of Native Americans, African Americans, I mean, just all of that. But even taking away the racial issues for a minute, just the labor issues. We have so many workers, members that sadly will get fired after 30 years of never missing a day at work at a factory. And the first thing some of them will say is, hey, Leone, glad I'm with this organization. I'm going to sue because they can't fire me after 30 years. Yeah, they can. Where'd you get the idea that anything in this country was ever figured out to be fair? It's all designed to flow upward to that 1%. So we owe people the truth. You can like it and say, well, I'm going to try to be one of those 1%. That's fine. But that's what we have, right? That's what we have in this country, is that commodification of humans that we produce for people. And then the little bit that we earn, we have to quickly give it back, mainly through housing. And so as we go forward, we also want to help make sure people, like, for example, property value. Why can some people decide that my house here, that I should have to pay higher property taxes? Who decides that? But it's taken as, oh yeah, that's okay. No, that's what you do. But that's not why. So I think we really, the last thing I'll close with is, you go back 150 years, right? Trail of Tears. So people were displaced. The Seminoles were displaced from Florida to Oklahoma because at that time it was accepted, frankly, among lots of folks, to treat Indian people that way. Thousands of folks died. They were displaced, forcefully displaced. Gentrification is not that different. It's that the oppressor, just like we learn in the movement over the decades how to organize things better, we think, the oppressor also learns. So they've developed private equity, they developed temp labor, they got all these things going. And now when I tell some supporters of our workers who should get their wages paid that were unpaid, they'll go, yeah, that's right. But that same person will say, but Leone, your fight against gentrification, I don't know, because those are natural market forces. So that's a little bit of the difference between worker and housing. I'll end with that, is that there seems to be this kind of agreement that, well, it's natural that land prices go up and you just got to keep moving. And it's not natural. That's all human decided. So I think we need to kind of demystify that and fight on that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sophia, your thoughts as we prepare to wrap up?
Sure. I will say again, Leone is a very hard act to follow. Yes, I think that's a beautiful contextualization. I mean, when I have the opportunity, I like to ground our conversations in housing around really the very ugly history of this country in general. You can't talk about wealth accumulation, you can't talk about land if you don't acknowledge the history of Native genocide and slavery. And that's not something to be paralyzed by, but that's something to recognize that this country has never paid any form of reparations, whether they're monetary, institutional, any other kind of thing. And the universe is vast as to what that could actually look like if we cared enough to do it, right? So I just appreciate you bringing that history in. One of my coworkers actually earlier today reminded me of the foundation of the concept of corporations has its roots in colonialism. So all of these different elements of extracting wealth and extracting profit are very much still with us today, and they guide everything about our existence in this country, in this world. And that does feel all very abstract. Leonie, I love that you mentioned earlier in response to this question about capitalism, you know, not bringing theory to people, but people understand exactly what it is we're talking about, even if the terms used to describe it are different, right? So where am I going? All to say, like, I think that these are things that can't be left out of housing conversations. They feel like very abstract pieces of it, but at the end of the day, people understand the dynamics that are taking place. They understand that we've allowed a company like Blackstone or a company like Carlyle to have hundreds upon hundreds of billions of dollars of assets under management. And the fact that this 1%, that these companies have so much of our wealth, means that people don't have enough money to put food on their table. They don't have enough money to put a roof over their head, to spend time with their children, to do all the things that all of us want to do in the short time that we have on this planet. I don't know where you all have taken me towards the end of this panel, I guess a very philosophical mindset. But all to say, I am very excited about the kind of growing language that people have to take on these concepts. And Desiree, I think your framing of a care, I don't think you would say care economy. I don't remember exactly what the words were, but really grounding our relations to one another in care and not extraction is so right and so smart, because I do think we end up talking about financial relationships and we end up re-emphasizing them. We end up putting them in a place where these are the kinds of relations that we think are important to prioritize. But what about the human ones? What about the familial ones? Those are actually the things that we absolutely should be talking about when we're doing housing justice organizing, when we're doing really any kind of organizing. So I don't want to forget that. I think that's a very important point. And I think when it comes time for us to break up the power relationships that exist right now between these Carlyles and these Blackstones and our political system and our elected officials, I think we need to emphasize exactly what it is that you're saying, that we need to focus on this kind of care relational way of thinking about things. So I will stop there. That was a lot. Tried to cover all of US history in 2 minutes.
Okay. And on that note, Desiree, I'll turn to you for your thoughts as we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think Leonie and Sophia have already said so many beautiful things. And I just think, you know, I mean, the history of how we got to where we are today, as you know, as Leonie and Sophia have already discussed, are so important, right? And I think particularly when we're talking about, like, you know, housing and finance, like financial capitalism has always been racialized, right? Like there's no way, like we can go all the way back to like mortgages were actually deployed as an instrument to dispossess Native people of land, like in the colonial era, right, in the 1600s. So like there's no disentangling like the operations of finance from the operations of racial capitalism. Like they're just fundamentally intertwined. And I think, you know, as Leonie was talking about, you know, like all of the things that we don't learn and don't teach our children in school, like I kept going back to, you know, like this idea of financial literacy, which is often proposed as a way of like helping people become, you know, better financial subjects, like more able to handle debts and so forth, right? And so much of that financial literacy is framed like at the individual level, like here's how to balance a checkbook, here's how to understand interest rates, and none of it is about these larger systems, right, that we're all kind of like differentially positioned in. And so, you know, I mean, I feel like Leonie and Sophia and I could have like a much longer conversation about, you know, like reinventing education, you know, and really, yeah, like centering these relations of like care and community, rather than just kind of like repurposing, you know, the language and relations of finance. So, I don't think I have much, much more to add, other than to like, reinforce the fact that, the state and, even activist mayors aren't going to like rescue us from this problem. They're deeply implicated with the operations of financial capitalism. And we really need to look to movements like Acre, like Leone's Worker Center, to make the change that we seek.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all. I know we've barely scratched the surface and there's so much that we could talk about. We will have to save that for another day, obviously. But I want to take a moment to thank each of the panelists, Sophia Lopez, Professor Desiree Fields, Leone Jose Bicchieri, for your time and your consideration and your very thoughtful presentations and discussion this afternoon. And I also want to thank the audience for for checking out the movie and this discussion. I hope that it has given us all something to learn from, some inspiration to carry forward in our respective day-to-day lives and our respective occupations. And I also thank my colleagues, Lily Ryan, Brother Ken Holman, Patrick Dixon, Juan Belman Guerrero, Lane Wyndham, Joe McCartan, and the other staff at the Kamenovitz Initiative for your support and guidance in helping this come together today. So, so I again appreciate all the work that you all have done and the audience for coming in today. We will see where we are. We will see where we are going. And I think that given there's always a challenge, but we know that people are working on the ground in communities, trying to make a difference. And as long as we know that the struggle, however romanticized it is, will still be something that we can use to achieve positive change in people's lives. So on that note, thank you all for everything. And we wish you a good rest of the day. Take care, be good to each other. And until next time, we will see you soon.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.